By March 6, 2026, the war centered on Iran had entered its 7th day since the strikes that began on February 28th. Tehran was still being hit. Healthcare sites had been struck. More than 100,000 people had been displaced inside Iran, and the conflict had already spilled into the Gulf and beyond, shaking shipping, energy markets, and the basic assumption that this crisis would stay contained. But the deepest crack in this story did not open last week. It opened more than 70 years ago, when American officials convinced themselves that one covert intervention could stabilize Iran, protect Western strategy, secure oil, and block Soviet influence, all without creating a larger historical debt. What followed was not a single coup and a single change of government. It was a chain reaction: restored monarchy, expanded repression, revolution, hostage-taking, nuclear confrontation, sanctions, proxy war, and now direct military escalation in a region that still carries the memory of outside control. The decision was sold as a practical fix. The legacy became a permanent argument over sovereignty, legitimacy, and who gets to decide Iran's future. Tonight, the question is not whether 1953 explains everything. It does not. The question is why that one decision still lives inside the logic of this crisis, inside the distrust, inside the slogans, inside the fear that every negotiation hides a trap. Join Rooms Where History, as we trace how America's 1953 decision in Iran reshaped the map of power, and why its echo still reaches the battlefield today. To understand the 1953 decision, you have to begin with a country that mattered far beyond its borders. Iran sat on immense oil reserves, bordered the Soviet sphere, and occupied a strategic space between the Gulf, South Asia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. After the Second World War, that geography became more than a map fact. It became a strategic obsession. American planners saw Iran as part of a wider containment line. British officials saw it as the site of one of their most valuable overseas assets. Iranian nationalists saw it differently, as a state whose resources had been extracted while sovereignty remained compromised. Those three readings of the same country could coexist for a while. Then oil turned them into collision. That is the first key to this story. The coup did not begin as an ideological drama about democracy versus dictatorship. It began as a struggle over who controlled value, who defined order, and whose risks would count when compromise became too expensive. That is the leverage. The risk was that once oil became a symbol of national dignity, no outside power could treat Iran as a technical management problem without deepening the political wound. That wound had a history. Long before Mossadegh, many Iranians believed foreign control over oil concessions reflected a larger pattern: outsiders taking revenue, prestige, and leverage, while Iran carried the political cost. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company stood at the center of that resentment. In Britain, the company was not viewed as just another commercial actor. It was tied to post-war finances, energy security, and national prestige. In Iran, the same structure was viewed as unequal and humiliating. That contrast matters because it shaped what each side believed was negotiable. To British officials, revising terms might be difficult but conceivable. Losing control outright looked intolerable. To Iranian nationalists, anything short of sovereign control looked like surrender dressed up as compromise. This is where many later misunderstandings begin. Both sides thought they were defending something fundamental. Britain thought it was defending law, contracts, and power. Iran thought it was defending dignity, ownership, and statehood. When those meanings attach to oil, numbers stop being just numbers. Revenue becomes identity. Concessions become symbols. And once symbols harden, even a technical settlement can start to look politically impossible. Into that climate stepped Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist politician who understood that oil was not only an economic issue, it was the one issue that could fuse parliamentary legitimacy, public emotion, and anti-colonial politics into a single force. When he became prime minister in April 1951, the Iranian parliament had already moved toward nationalization, and he made immediate implementation the center of his government's identity. That made him enormously popular at home. It also turned him into a strategic problem abroad. Records from the period show that American officials recognized the seriousness of the crisis almost immediately, because unrest in Abadan and disruption in production threatened not only Iran's finances, but broader regional confidence. Mossadegh's move was bold precisely because it was both practical and symbolic. He wanted revenue, yes, but he also wanted to prove that Iran could reclaim control without asking permission from London. On paper, it looked like an assertion of sovereignty. In practice, it triggered a confrontation that neither Iran nor Britain could easily de-escalate without looking weak. And weakness, in that moment, was politically expensive for everyone involved. The British response was immediate and severe. Britain imposed an economic embargo, pushed the dispute into international legal forums, and worked to isolate Iranian oil from global buyers. The Abadan refinery, one of the largest in the world, became more than an industrial site. It became the place where a sovereignty claim met the reality of world markets. Iran had nationalized the industry, but without technicians, buyers, shipping access, and financial channels, control on paper did not automatically become usable power. That is one of the hard strategic lessons inside this story. Ownership and operational capacity are not the same thing. Britain understood that and used it. Tehran understood it too, but believed national determination could outlast external pressure. The result was a tightening squeeze. Oil income collapsed. Budget pressure rose. The state's room to maneuver narrowed. In London, policymakers hoped pressure would force Iran back into a settlement. In Tehran, pressure confirmed every nationalist claim about foreign domination. So the system adjusted, not toward moderation, but toward mutual proof. Each side became more certain that backing down would invite greater losses later. At this stage, the United States under Harry Truman did not yet see a coup as the obvious answer. Washington worried about instability, worried about communist expansion, and worried that economic collapse in Iran could open space for the Two-Day Party, the main pro-Soviet political force. But the Truman administration also believed there was still a chance for negotiated settlement. That distinction matters. The U.S. was not neutral, but it was not initially aligned with Britain's most aggressive instincts either. Newly released records and later archival work show that British approaches for stronger action were met, for a time, with hesitation. American policymakers still hoped that some oil arrangement could keep Iran solvent, preserve Western interests, and avoid driving Mossadegh fully into a corner. That was the breathing space in this story. For a brief period, Washington still treated the crisis as something to manage rather than overthrow. But leverage only matters if time is on your side. And time, by late 1952, was running out for nearly everyone. For Britain's patience, for Iran's finances, and for an American policy trying to split the difference between anti-communism and anti-colonial realism. And timing forced a choice, because Mossadegh's position was both strong and fragile at once. He had public legitimacy and nationalist energy, but he was governing a country under deep economic stress, with powerful domestic rivals, a wary monarch, and a fragmented political field. His opponents included royalists, conservative clerical figures, sections of the army, and elites who feared disorder more than foreign influence. His supporters were also not a single bloc. They included nationalists, bazaar interests, urban crowds, and at times groups whose long-term goals were not identical. That kind of coalition can mobilize power, but it is hard to discipline under pressure. This matters because later supporters of the coup would argue that Mossadegh was destabilizing the country. Critics would counter that he was being destabilized from outside while trying to protect sovereignty. Both arguments contain something real. Mossadegh did centralize authority and take exceptional measures as the crisis deepened. But he did so inside a crisis structured by embargo, isolation, and foreign pressure. The problem was timing. A leader trying to preserve democratic legitimacy while surviving an economic siege will often make choices that protect the state short-term and damage institutions long-term. One of the decisive turns came in July 1952, when Mossadegh briefly resigned amid conflict with the Shah over control of the military, only to return after major street protests. That episode told every outside observer something important. First, Mossadegh still possessed real mobilizing power. Second, the monarchy was weaker than it looked. Third, Iran's streets had become part of the decision-making mechanism. That last point would matter enormously in 1953. Once crowds become an instrument of political legitimacy, they can also become a target for manipulation. The July crisis also intensified elite anxiety. If Mossadegh could fall and return through public pressure, then the system was more volatile than foreign policymakers wanted to admit. To some in Washington and London, this did not prove democracy was working. It proved that Iran was becoming unpredictable. And unpredictable states, in Cold War thinking, were dangerous because they could slip. Not necessarily to Moscow in a straight line, but into instability that Moscow might exploit. That signal changed the math, but only gradually. The key shift was psychological. Mossadegh stopped looking like a negotiator with whom order could be restored and started looking like a nationalist force that might outrun external control. The British conclusion hardened first. By late 1952, London was pressing more seriously for Mossadegh's removal, arguing that Iran's crisis could not be solved while he remained in power. Newly declassified U.S. documents later confirmed that the British approached Washington about ousting him and that the Americans, at least temporarily, declined. That refusal is important because it proves the coup was not mechanically inevitable. Policy could still have gone another way. Truman's team still hoped an oil deal might be salvaged and did not want to leap into a risky covert operation with uncertain consequences. But while Britain saw hesitation as drift, American officials saw caution as prudence. This was one of those moments where strategy splits over diagnosis. Is the problem a difficult leader, or a larger structure that no leader can solve without pain? If you think the problem is the leader, regime change becomes tempting. If you think the problem is structural, overthrow only resets the surface while deepening the grievance underneath. The tragedy of 1953 is that Washington eventually moved from the second reading to the first. And once it did, the available tools changed completely. The transfer of power in Washington accelerated everything. Dwight D. Eisenhower entered office in January 1953 with a national security team more open to covert action and more receptive to British framing. The Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles at State and Allen Dulles at the CIA, helped recast the Iranian crisis inside a harder Cold War lens. The argument was not simply that Mossadegh threatened oil interests. It was that prolonged instability could benefit the Soviet Union, whether or not Mossadegh himself intended that outcome. This was a classic Cold War move. Treat uncertainty as strategic risk, then treat intervention as preventive stabilization. On paper, it offered a clean logic. Remove the destabilizing prime minister, restore royal authority, reassure allies, protect access, deny Moscow an opening. But strategy is dangerous when it compresses several different problems into one answer. Oil nationalism, domestic legitimacy, anti-colonial politics, and communist fear were not identical. Washington increasingly acted as though they were. That simplification made covert action easier to approve. It also ensured that the solution would be cruder than the problem. Which is where the mechanism mattered. The plan that emerged, Operation TPAJAX, better known as Operation Ajax, was not a single dramatic order followed by a clean execution. It was a covert political operation built from persuasion, bribery, propaganda, elite pressure, and selective use of local networks. The CIA worked with British intelligence and with Iranian actors already hostile to Mossadegh. The goal was not merely to replace one official with another, it was to create the appearance that Mossadegh's position had collapsed inside Iran itself. That is how many covert interventions work at their most effective. They do not rely only on foreign muscle. They weaponize existing fractures until the result looks domestic enough to sustain. Planning documents and later official histories show the extent to which Washington understood this as a political engineering project, not a battlefield campaign. That distinction is central to the episode. The room where history turned was not a trench or a front line. It was the network between intelligence headquarters, embassy channels, palace calculations, and Tehran's streets. And once those channels synchronized, deniability became part of the weapon. At the center of that network stood Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., the CIA operative sent to help coordinate the effort on the ground. But the operation depended just as much on local intermediaries, military officers, newspaper editors, political brokers, clerical contacts, and street organizers. This matters because the coup succeeded not only because foreigners wanted it, it succeeded because they were able to align with Iranian interests that already existed. That does not reduce outside responsibility. It clarifies how covert action really works. Foreign intelligence rarely invents a political fracture from nothing. It studies, funds, amplifies, and sequences fractures that are already available. In Iran, those fractures included fear of disorder, hostility to the Tudeh party, resentment toward Mossadegh's concentration of power, and royalist loyalty to the Shah. The plan exploited all of them. Propaganda painted Mossadegh as reckless. Pressure was applied to wavering elites. Demonstrations were organized to create momentum. Military actors were primed to move once legitimacy appeared to shift. The system looked unstable because it was unstable. The coup worked because it made instability speak in the voice of inevitability. One of the most revealing parts of the story is the role of the Shah. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was not the commanding architect of the operation in the way later mythology sometimes suggests. He was cautious, uncertain, and at times reluctant. His authority mattered because constitutional and symbolic legitimacy still passed through the monarchy. But he was not eager to take the full risk of direct confrontation if the plan failed. That hesitation tells you something important about the moment. Even those who wanted Mossadegh out knew the outcome was not guaranteed. The Shah's role became decisive through signed decrees, or firmans, dismissing Mossadegh and appointing Fazlollah Zahedi. On paper, that made the move look legal. In practice, legality depended on power following paper, and paper alone does not move troops or crowds. The Shah's value to the operation was that he could lend formal cover to an engineered transfer of force. That is the leverage. The risk was obvious. If the decrees failed to trigger obedience, the monarchy itself could be discredited or destroyed. In other words, Washington and London were not just betting against Mossadegh, they were betting on the Shah's survivability. The first attempt in mid-August 1953 went badly. Forces loyal to the plot tried to move against Mossadegh using the Shah's decrees, but the effort faltered. Mossadegh's side acted quickly. Some conspirators were arrested. The Shah fled the country, first to Iraq, then to Rome. For a moment, the coup looked finished. That failed first push is essential to understanding how contingent the whole enterprise really was. In hindsight, the August 19th outcome can look linear. In the moment, it was messy, uncertain, and close to collapse. This is one of the most important corrections any serious documentary should make. Turning points do not feel inevitable while they are happening. They feel improvised, fragile, and vulnerable to a few decisions in a few hours. After the failure, some American officials thought the operation should be considered lost. But operatives on the ground kept working the political environment, and that choice, to continue after apparent failure, may have been one of the most consequential micro-decisions in the entire story. The problem was timing, again. A failed coup attempt can destroy legitimacy, or it can clarify who is still willing to move. What happened next was not magic. It was momentum engineering. On August 19, 1953, crowds, military elements, and royalist networks converged with enough force to overwhelm Mossadegh's remaining position. Radio announcements, symbolic gestures, armed units, and public spectacle worked together. Tehran became a contest over perception as much as coercion. Who represented order? Who represented legality? Who still commanded obedience? Once that perception shifted, the physical balance shifted with it. Mossadegh was overthrown. Zahedi emerged. The Shah's restoration suddenly looked less like a gamble and more like a fait accompli. Britannica notes that around 300 people died in the fighting in Tehran. That number matters because it punctures the fantasy of clean, covert action. Even when intervention is designed to appear political rather than military, it still moves through bodies, fear, and irreversible violence. The moment it went public, the immediate Western reading was success. The deeper Iranian reading was different. Foreign-backed power had overridden a nationalist government that had claimed popular legitimacy. Both readings would survive, and over time, the second one would outlast the first. In Washington, the immediate result appeared compelling. A crisis had been solved. An unstable nationalist had been removed. A monarch acceptable to the West was back in position. The Soviet threat, or at least the fear attached to it, seemed more manageable. For British policymakers, the outcome also created a path back toward oil arrangements that would not leave them entirely shut out. This is the short-term case for the decision, and it should be taken seriously if the analysis is going to remain neutral. The coup did achieve immediate strategic objectives. It stabilized the formal alignment of Iran within the Western camp. It reassured allies that the United States would act. It reduced the risk, at least in the eyes of decision-makers, that prolonged paralysis in Tehran might open room for forces they feared. If you were an American or British official evaluating the map in late 1953, The operation looked efficient, relatively inexpensive, and successful. That is precisely why it became dangerous as precedent. A policy that works in the short run can teach the wrong lesson about what success means. Because success was not only about removing Mossadegh, it was also about what kind of order replaced him. In the aftermath, the Shah's rule became more secure, more centralized, and increasingly dependent on external backing. A new government under Zaidi took office. Foreign influence did not return in the exact form it had before nationalization, but the overall structure moved back toward Western strategic comfort. The 1954 oil consortium diluted Britain's previous monopoly, but restored major foreign participation in Iranian oil under a new framework. For policymakers in Washington, this looked like stabilization with benefits. Oil back in the system, a friendly ruler in place, and a lesson in the usefulness of covert action. But inside Iran, a different memory was being written. The state had survived, yet popular sovereignty had been cut off at the moment it most clearly challenged outside pressure. That memory would not dominate every year immediately, but it settled into political consciousness. And because it settled there, the coup became not just an event, but a reference point. Evidence that foreign powers would intervene when Iranian democracy threatened strategic interests. This is where the story becomes more complex than a simple morality play. The Shah's Iran did not stand still. It modernized in visible ways. It pursued development, closer Western ties, military strengthening, and later major social reforms under the White Revolution. For some observers, especially abroad, this seemed like confirmation that the 1953 decision had put Iran back on a stable and progressive path. But modernization is not the same as legitimacy. Reform from above can widen the state's capabilities while narrowing the political space in which citizens can challenge the state. That contradiction would become central to the next phase of Iran's history. The Shah gained resources, security support, and international backing. But the regime also built deeper habits of surveillance and repression. Over time, those habits fed the very forces that would later define themselves against him. In strategic terms, the coup bought order. In political terms, it hollowed the channel through which order might have been renewed consensually. And once consent weakens, coercion rises to compensate. That is not unique to Iran. It is one of the recurring after-effects of externally reinforced rule. The security state became one of the most enduring legacies of the post-coup order. Over time, organizations like SAVAK came to symbolize the monarchy's reliance on intelligence, censorship, and intimidation. To be precise, the Shah's repression had domestic roots and domestic agents. It should not be reduced to a foreign puppet story, but it also cannot be separated from the political settlement created after 1953, because that settlement strengthened a ruler whose survival increasingly depended on containing dissent rather than absorbing it. That distinction matters. The coup did not cause every later abuse in a straight line. What it did was alter the structure of incentives. It taught the monarchy that external backing could offset deficits of internal legitimacy. It taught opponents that peaceful constitutional nationalism had limits when major foreign interests were threatened. And it taught a generation of Iranians that the language of reform could coexist with the machinery of coercion. Once that lesson settles, later politics harden. Moderates lose credibility. Radicals gain emotional force. Conspiracy thinking grows not because people are irrational, but because history has already shown them intervention is possible. By the 1970s, The Shah looked strong from the outside. Oil wealth had surged. Iran was armed, visible, and regionally important. Washington saw it as a pillar of regional security. But strength on the surface can hide a more dangerous weakness underneath: rising social distance between state and society. The lower classes, the bazaar, clerics, students, and many educated critics did not read the Shah's order the way Western strategists did. They saw corruption, repression, foreign dependence, and a ruling culture that seemed insulated from ordinary costs. Britannica's summary of the revolution is blunt. Opposition to the Shah's autocracy, Western interference, economic difficulties, and socio-political repression all fed the uprising. Notice the structure of that list. Western interference is not a side note. It sits beside domestic autocracy as part of the same legitimacy crisis. That is the echo of 1953. Overthrowing Mossadegh did not merely remove one leader, it damaged faith that Iran's political future could be shaped without outside veto. So, when crisis returned, resentment did not travel only toward the Shah. It also traveled through him, toward the powers seen as having restored and protected him. When the Iranian Revolution of 1978–79 erupted, it was not a simple replay of 1953 in reverse. It was broader, more social, more religiously charged, and more transformative. But the coup remained inside its political memory. The revolution was fueled by many grievances, yet one of the most potent was the belief that Iran had been denied authentic self-determination. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini did not invent that grievance. He inherited and weaponized it. Anti-Americanism in revolutionary Iran was therefore not only ideological theater, it drew force from a historical claim that the United States had intervened decisively in Iran's politics when an elected nationalist government threatened strategic interests. That memory helped revolutionary actors frame the monarchy not as a merely domestic regime, but as a system sustained by foreign power, which meant opposing the Shah also meant opposing the United States. The revolution's success turned that interpretation into state doctrine. This is one of the most important transitions in the whole story. A covert decision taken in the name of anti-communist stability ultimately fed a revolutionary identity organized around resistance to American interference. The hostage crisis in November 1979 made that historical memory concrete for the world. Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held American diplomats for 444 days. The immediate trigger was the Shah's admission to the United States for medical treatment, but the deeper fear was historical, that Washington might once again use the embassy and its networks as a base for intervention, just as many Iranians believed it had in 1953. Whether every hostage-taker understood the full archival history is not the point. The point is that 1953 had become a usable political memory. The embassy was not just a building. It was read as a possible instrument of renewed foreign manipulation. From the American side, the hostage crisis confirmed the Islamic Republic's hostility and lawlessness. From the Iranian revolutionary side, it was framed as preemption against another coup. These were incompatible interpretations, and both became foundational. Once that happened, diplomacy stopped operating on a neutral field. Each side's present was being filtered through a different reading of the same past. And once mistrust becomes historical rather than situational, it is far harder to bargain away. From that point forward, the U.S.-Iran relationship operated inside a cycle of mutual suspicion. Diplomatic ties were broken, regional crises were filtered through ideological hostility. The Iran-Iraq War, U.S. sanctions, proxy conflicts, and later nuclear negotiations all unfolded in the shadow of a deeper legitimacy problem. Tehran came to view American pressure not as isolated policy disagreements, but as part of a long pattern of containment, coercion, and intervention. Washington came to view Tehran not as a wounded post-coup state with security anxieties, but as a revisionist regime whose hostility was central to its identity. Both readings captured something true. Both also narrowed space for compromise. That is why 1953 still matters. It did not freeze history. It shaped the starting assumptions each side carried into later confrontations. And assumptions matter because they determine what signals look credible. If Iran assumes the United States ultimately wants regime change, concessions look dangerous. If the United States assumes Iran uses diplomacy mainly to buy time, agreements look fragile. The past does not dictate every move, but it changes the meaning of every move. That pattern becomes especially clear in the nuclear dispute. By the early 21st century, Iran's nuclear program had become the main arena in which history, security, prestige, and mistrust all collided. Western governments argued that enrichment and opaque facilities threatened non-proliferation and regional stability. Tehran argued that its program was sovereign, lawful, and repeatedly interpreted through a double standard. Behind those claims sat the older wound. If outside powers had already overturned an elected Iranian government once, why would Iranian leaders trust technical negotiations that could later be turned into pressure? This does not excuse Iranian opacity or regional tactics. It explains why distrust ran deeper than the text of any agreement. When the JCPOA was reached in 2015, it worked in part because it created verifiable constraints and reciprocal relief. It was not trust-based, it was architecture-based. That was the logic. Because trust was thin, institutions had to do the work. But architecture only matters if political actors keep inhabiting it. The problem was timing again. What one administration builds, another can unwind, and each reversal confirms the other side's darkest interpretation. The American withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 deepened that pattern. From Washington's perspective, the deal was flawed and too narrow. From Tehran's perspective, the withdrawal validated the argument that the United States could not be trusted to maintain a negotiated framework even when Iran had accepted constraints in exchange for relief. Reuters' timeline captured the basic turn. The United States pulled out and reimposed severe sanctions, while Iran later reduced compliance and expanded enrichment. This is not a simple one-side story. Tehran also made choices that intensified alarm across the region, but the structural effect of 2018 was unmistakable. It weakened the camp inside Iran that could argue negotiated limits were worth the political cost. It strengthened hardliners who had always said the American objective was not a better deal, but permanent pressure. That is another echo of 1953. Not because the nuclear file is the same as the oil crisis, it is not. The echo lies in the recurring Iranian conclusion that major concessions do not reliably buy security when American policy can pivot with domestic politics. Regional proxy conflict then made direct confrontation more likely. Iran expanded influence through relationships with armed groups and partner networks across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Gaza, and Yemen. From Tehran's perspective, this was deterrence by depth. If the homeland was threatened, pressure could be distributed across the region. From the U.S. and Israeli perspective, it was destabilizing expansion under ideological cover. Each side's doctrine made the other side's doctrine more plausible. That is how security spirals harden. And once a spiral matures, every crisis starts carrying the risk of a wider war that nobody originally planned. The long rivalry Reuters summarized over the past decades shows this ratchet effect clearly. Hostage crisis, sanctions, proxy warfare, nuclear disputes, covert killings, retaliatory strikes. Each round leaves the baseline higher than before. The reason 1953 matters here is not that it mechanically caused every later militia or missile decision. It is that it helped define the emotional grammar of the relationship, especially the Iranian belief that strategic autonomy requires distrust of Western intentions, and the American belief that Iranian power, left unchecked, will be used coercively. Which brings us back to the present crisis. The current war did not emerge from 1953 alone. It also grew out of nuclear escalation, Israeli-Iranian confrontation, regional proxy dynamics, and failed diplomacy in the 2020s. But the historical memory of intervention still shapes how this war is interpreted. For many in Iran, outside attack is never just about present capability. It is read through a longer pattern in which foreign powers claim necessity while deciding Iran's future over Iranian heads. For many in Washington and allied capitals, Iranian appeals to sovereignty sound selective because Tehran has itself projected force through the region. Both views can point to evidence. Neither cancels the deeper fact that 1953 altered the moral terrain on which later pressure would be judged. That is why the current war feels, in part, like an argument over history. One side says the issue is present threat. The other says present threat cannot be separated from a legacy of intervention. The result is a crisis in which even accurate signals are hard to read, because each side assumes bad faith before the message is even finished. There is another reason the coup still echoes. It changed the internal political market inside Iran. After 1953, politicians could no longer easily promise that national independence and negotiated cooperation with the West would reinforce each other. That formula had been tested under Mossadegh and had collapsed violently. Later, Iranian leaders inherited that failure. Moderates could still argue for engagement, but hardliners always had a powerful counterexample. An elected nationalist once tried to assert sovereignty within the language of law and parliament, and outside powers overthrew him anyway. This is not simply propaganda. It is political capital drawn from lived history. The more often Washington applies pressure while publicly discussing Iran's internal future, the stronger that historical card becomes. And the more Iran uses that history to justify repression or external militancy, the more the United States and its allies conclude that pressure was always necessary. That is the trap. A coup meant to secure leverage in 1953 helped create a narrative environment in which leverage itself became evidence of hostile intent. In strategy, that is a severe, long-term cost. It also changed American habits. Operation Ajax was read in Washington as proof that covert action could be a cheap and effective tool for reshaping political outcomes abroad. That institutional lesson did not stay in Iran. It became part of a broader Cold War mindset in which covert intervention seemed faster and more flexible than overt war. Historians have long argued that the apparent success of the Iran coup influenced later thinking about similar operations elsewhere. This matters for the Iran story because the decision's impact was therefore not only bilateral. It fed a wider American confidence in covert engineering. That confidence often underestimated what could not be measured immediately. The delayed backlash, the damage to legitimacy, and the political memory left behind in societies that experienced intervention not as stabilization, but as theft. So even at the level of U.S. statecraft, 1953 was formative. It seemed to prove that short-term precision could solve geopolitical problems. The longer record suggests something harsher. Covert wins can be strategically real and still politically corrosive. They can succeed against a government while failing against history. At this point, a fair analysis has to confront a difficult question. Was the decision irrational at the time? The honest answer is no. From the perspective of American officials in 1953, the choice had a logic. They saw a strategically placed state under economic strain, a powerful anti-Western nationalist premier, communist organizational capacity waiting in the background, a major ally in Britain demanding action, and an opportunity to restore a friendly ruler at relatively low cost. Those inputs do not produce one inevitable policy, but they do produce a coherent interventionist argument. That matters because historical analysis becomes shallow when it treats past decision-makers as cartoon villains or fools. They were working inside a structure of fear, alliance commitments, and limited foresight. The problem is not that the decision lacked logic. The problem is that the logic was short horizon. It measured immediate geopolitical gains more clearly than long horizon legitimacy costs. This is why the story has value. It shows how rational policy can still generate disastrous political aftershocks when the metric of success is too narrow. But coherence is not the same as wisdom. The costs the operation discounted were not secondary. They were central. The coup weakened the legitimacy of constitutional nationalism in Iran. It tied the monarchy more tightly to foreign power. It encouraged reliance on repression. It made later anti-American rhetoric easier to ground in a real event. It complicated every future negotiation by inserting a precedent of betrayal into the middle of any bargain. And it did all of that while persuading American institutions that the operation had been a success. This is the strategic paradox at the heart of the episode. A decision can be tactically effective, operationally competent, and still historically corrosive. The more precisely it solves the immediate problem, the more tempting it is to ignore the larger political environment it has poisoned. That is why 1953 remains so relevant. It is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about statecraft that mistakes control for consent and short-term quiet for long-term stability. And once those are confused, policy starts borrowing against a future it cannot see. The present war has made that future visible again. Reuters and AP reporting this week shows a conflict widening beyond simple bilateral exchange. Strikes in Tehran, attacks verified on health facilities, displacement inside Iran, retaliation against Gulf states and regional targets, and concerns about the Strait of Hormuz and global energy flows. In strategic terms, this is exactly the kind of regionalized crisis that makes old decisions matter again. Because once a war touches oil, shipping, allied bases, regime survival, and domestic legitimacy at the same time, history rushes back into the room. Every actor starts asking old questions in new language. Can outside force produce a durable political outcome? Can pressure change regime behavior without collapsing the region? Can deterrence coexist with dignity? Can negotiations survive after repeated reversals? These are not 1953 questions in a literal sense, but they are questions shaped by a relationship whose deepest foundation was cracked in 1953. The more the war widens, the more that older crack becomes harder to ignore. There is also a human dimension that strategy often flattens. In 1953, policymakers in Washington were thinking in terms of leverage, containment, alliance management, and resource security. In 2026, civilians in Tehran, in the Gulf, and across the region are again paying the price of decisions made far above them. That does not erase agency inside Iran, the United States, Israel, or among regional actors. But it should force a broader view of what cost means. Cost is not only measured in oil flow, territorial advantage, or deterrence credibility. It is also measured in political trauma, inherited fear, and the way whole societies begin to interpret external pressure as existential threat. Once a population reaches that point, even genuine diplomacy becomes harder to sell domestically. That is how loss compounds over generations. The people under bombardment today are not living in 1953, but they are living inside structures partly shaped by it. And if a documentary like this has any value, it is in restoring that continuity, without pretending continuity is destiny. History matters. It does not excuse everything, but it does explain why some conflicts become so difficult to unwind. So what exactly did America's 1953 Iran decision achieve? In the short term, it restored a pro-Western political order, reopened a workable path for oil, reassured Britain, blocked Mossadegh, and reduced elite fear that Iran's instability might tilt toward the Soviet camp. Those were real achievements on the terms policymakers were using at the time. What did it damage? It damaged the credibility of external claims to respect Iranian self-determination. It damaged the long-term legitimacy of any Iranian orders seen as too closely aligned with Washington. It damaged the possibility that constitutional nationalism might remain the dominant language of sovereignty in Iran. And perhaps most importantly, it damaged trust across time. Because once a society believes a foreign power has overridden its democratic will, that memory survives every later negotiation. It can be dormant, it can be instrumentalized, but it does not disappear. The price, then, was not only political stability in one moment purchased at the cost of another leader's fall. The deeper price was future interpretive control. America lost the ability to appear in Iran as a neutral or disinterested actor. That matters in the present, because credibility is one of the most valuable assets in any crisis. If your adversary believes every diplomatic offer hides coercive intent, negotiation becomes weak before it begins. If your own domestic audience believes compromise equals humiliation, even sensible bargains become politically toxic. That is the condition U.S.-Iran relations have repeatedly inhabited. And 1953 is one of the main reasons why. The coup gave Iran's rulers, across very different regimes, a durable story about foreign interference. It also gave American policymakers a durable story about the utility of pressure. The collision between those stories is one reason the relationship keeps swinging between confrontation and thin, reversible détente. In practical terms, this means that every new crisis carries old emotional baggage. A nuclear file becomes a sovereignty test. A sanctions package becomes a regime change signal. A military deployment becomes a possible prelude to intervention. And because those interpretations are not fully irrational, they cannot simply be dismissed away. That is why the echo lasts. It is carried not only by governments, but by the meanings populations assign to governments. A deeper lesson sits underneath all of this. States often justify intervention by focusing on immediate strategic asymmetry, the chance to act now at relatively low cost rather than wait for a larger threat later. Sometimes that logic is valid, but it becomes dangerous when it treats political legitimacy as a soft variable that can be repaired after the fact. Legitimacy is not soft. It is slow-moving hard power. It determines whether order can outlast coercion, whether reforms can survive setbacks, and whether foreign ties are seen as partnership or subordination. In 1953, Washington acted as though strategic control could compensate for legitimacy loss. In the short term, it could. Over decades, it could not. That is why this decision still deserves attention. It is a case study in how policymakers under pressure can correctly identify a real risk and still choose a remedy that deepens the system's long-run instability. That does not make them irrational. It makes them historically limited, seeing the map more clearly than the society underneath it. And when that happens, the map wins first, while the society wins later, often through violent correction. Another lesson is about misreading what nationalism can absorb. American and British officials in 1953 believed they could remove Mossadegh and still preserve enough Iranian consent to keep the new order stable. For a while, they were right. The Shah ruled for decades. But durability is not the same as resolution. Unsettled grievances can survive under the surface for years if repression is strong, oil revenue is high, and alternatives are fragmented. The mistake is to assume silence means settlement. In Iran, the unresolved issue was not merely who ruled. It was who had the right to decide who ruled. That issue returned with force in 1979 and has colored every major confrontation since. When current Iranian officials invoke sovereignty against outside pressure, they are not only protecting regime interests, they are also speaking to a historical memory that still resonates beyond the regime. That is why external coercion in Iran so often produces mixed political effects. It can weaken rulers materially while strengthening the broader social narrative that foreign powers remain willing to dictate outcomes. The same action can therefore both pressure the state and validate its story. And there is one more lesson, this time about policy memory. Governments change, administrations rotate, strategies are updated, and yet other countries often experience all of those shifts as one long continuum. Americans can separate Truman from Eisenhower, the coup from the nuclear talks, Obama from Trump. Many Iranians cannot afford that luxury in the same way, because what persists in memory is the pattern: interference, alignment with the Shah, support for hostile pressure, sanctions, threats, and reversals. This does not mean all American policies are identical. It means foreign audiences often judge continuity more by outcome than by internal intent. That is a warning for any great power. You do not control only your own motives. You also live with the cumulative interpretation of your behavior. By the time current war reached its 7th day this March, that cumulative interpretation was already doing work across the region. It shaped fear, rhetoric, alliances, and what each side imagined the other really wanted. In other words, 1953 is not just remembered. It is operational. So when people ask how America's 1953 Iran decision echoes into today's crisis, the most accurate answer is not that it caused the present war by itself. History is never that simple. The accurate answer is that it changed the political chemistry of the relationship. It altered what legitimacy meant inside Iran. It weakened the credibility of pro-Western constitutional nationalism. It strengthened the long-term power of anti-intervention narratives. It encouraged American confidence in covert leverage. It helped produce a monarchy whose modernization could not outrun its legitimacy deficit. It fed a revolution that made anti-Americanism part of state identity. And it set the emotional background against which sanctions, nuclear bargaining, proxy conflict, and direct war would later be interpreted. The 1953 decision solved an immediate strategic problem. It also planted a lasting dispute over sovereignty that outlived the Cold War, outlived the Shah, and outlived several attempts at détente. That is not a small echo. That is a structural one. And structures are exactly what documentary history is supposed to reveal. Today we have traced how one American decision in 1953 changed far more than one government in Tehran. In the short term, it achieved what its authors wanted. It removed Mossadegh, restored a friendly ruler, stabilized Western access and influence, and reduced immediate Cold War anxiety. But it also damaged something far harder to repair. It damaged trust in the possibility that Iran's political future could be decided without foreign intervention. It damaged the credibility of outside claims to neutrality. It damaged the long-term legitimacy of the order that replaced Mossadegh. And that is the true price of the decision. Stability purchased with legitimacy. Leverage purchased with memory. Control purchased with a grievance that did not die when the operation ended. The deeper lesson is not a slogan about right or wrong. It is a harder analytical principle. When states solve a short-term strategic problem by overriding a society's political self-belief, the apparent victory can remain alive for decades as a hidden source of future conflict. That does not explain every missile, every sanction, every proxy war, or every choice made by Iran's rulers since then. But it does explain why the relationship so often returns to suspicion faster than it returns to trust. And in a week like this one, while war widens, civilians suffer, and the region absorbs another shock, that lesson matters. However governments justify their actions, war still reaches ordinary people first, and it almost always leaves behind more grief than clarity. If you found this episode valuable, please take a moment to like the video. It helps serious documentary history reach more viewers who want evidence, context, and honest analysis rather than slogans. Subscribe to Rooms Where History if you value stories about the moments when one decision behind closed doors changed the lives of millions outside them. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you think the greater cost of 1953 was the loss of Iranian democracy, the loss of long-term trust, or the belief in Washington that covert success could solve political problems cleanly. Thank you for watching, and whatever side of the argument you come from, may this region see fewer funerals, fewer ruins, and a real path back from war.